All right. So growth, the way we're going to look at it is from an historical perspective. So let's look at the basic fact. What we call economic growth tend to be that thing we measure in a way or another with GNP. As you know, people like to say, oh, GNP is the wrong measure, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of better measures. In fact, economists tend to think not of GNP, we tend to think of happiness, utility, welfare, personal notion of well-being. And we just recognize that many notions of personal well-being are not measurable. And so if we have to make interpersonal comparison or international comparison or even across communities, we need to use values that can be measured. And so GNP is a good proxy. There's plenty of evidence that, in fact, it's highly correlated with pretty much every measure of social welfare. Now, the funny thing about GNP is that it's a very bad measure to understand development when you look at economic history. That is, when you look at the problem of growth in a very long run perspective. Why? Well, let me just throw there the idea to you without going through it technically, because it would take us off and would take into an issue of measurement of relative prices and goods. The reason is that as you go backward, the prices today of the goods and services people would consume 500 years ago are extremely small. Like if you think of the typical consumption basket of an average person, not even 500, even 200 or 100 years ago, it's stuff that we now produce with relatively little effort at very low prices. And so when we look at their income from our perspective, it's extremely low. And once you start going with low numbers, then the differences are almost invisible. So you happen to have this phenomenon that Madison pointed out first, if I recall correctly, but also Kuznets and many, that if you try to compute GNP measures over time from the Greeks or even the Egyptian to the 18th, 19th century, you get almost a flat line. As if people live more or less at the same level of income and consumption for an incredibly long time. On the other hand, you can try to make the following exercise. What's the difference in the quality of living between having a sewage system or not having a sewage system? To me, it's fairly large. Think of the smell of shit all over and living in the smell, right? What's the difference between having paved street and non-paved street with mud? Think about traveling on a Roman street that has been properly paved and traveling on a non-paved street or road, right? And having to do miles with that with your horse or by foot or with your cart. It's a huge difference. Think about having glass windows or not having glass windows. Think about being able to read and write or not being able to read and write. Think about basic things like, for example, this is a recent discovery, true, realizing there are germs. And that by washing your hands and keeping clean your food and keeping excrements and other sources of bacteria away from your food, you may avoid having diarrhea every day. Well, that doesn't show up much in GNP, right? But it shows up a lot in standard of living. You can go on with the examples. Think about having a chimney and not having a chimney in your house when you're actually using the fireplace to keep warm and to cook. Makes a huge difference between living in a house that, at least partially because of the chimney, is without smoke and dust from the burning, and houses that which there's an open fire and the smoke and the dust is all around you and you live in it and you breathe it and it's on your clothes and you eat it. Okay? So these are all things that when I try, and you can go on, right? I mean, just sit down, start thinking how the hunter-gatherer lived and so on. You can go on with an enormous list of small improvements, small discoveries in technological discoveries, in fact. Each one of those, right, technological discoveries, They improve remarkably the standard of living. They're in some sense necessary step for economic progress. But when I try to measure them in terms of GNP, I don't get a lot, right? I don't really get a lot, right? And so this impression that we have by using the GNP number of a very flat line that takes off only in the 18th century is somewhat misleading. It's partly true, but it's also misleading. Right? And if we try to understand economic growth in the long run, we have to accept that there were thousands of small inventions and innovation that improved people's standard of living, and in some sense were probably necessary step for further advances. Okay? And when I look at GNP data, are not really recorded and give me a very distorted view of what economic growth is. On the other hand, it's also true, and we'll go back to that at a certain point, that whatever happened somewhere in Northern Europe between the end, second half, I would say, of the 17th century and the end of the 18th, 1650, 1800, say, gave rise to an explosion of produced good and measurable good and knowledge and technological improvement that is certainly unique, that has transformed the standard of living enormously and has transformed it for millions and millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, billions in fact, okay? And that probably might even be accelerating along certain dimensions. We'll speculate about it toward the end of the course in the last few decades. But then again, you know, people have the tendency of seeing miracles and change of epochal changes and dramatic breakthrough every 2 and 2, so we better be cautious. Maybe nothing special is happening. Maybe yes, maybe not, right? Okay, so why did I say that? I said that because if you now take that point of view and you sit here in 1700 and you are, well, let's name the famous one, Adam Smith, or before him you are one of the French physiocrats, okay? Or you are the people around Smith, you know, Peel, rather, and start thinking about the working of this market system, you realize two things. That yes, things are happening. Things are happening. There's a lot of good stuff going on. People are living better. There's a lot of commerce and entrepreneurial activity and so on that seems to be different from the past, but certainly suggests there is a lot of growth. But on the other hand, things in the past did like this, right? And you have noticed that there were periods of growth, but they, in income per capita, but they somehow ended. And they always more or less ended in a certain way, very similar. We'll go to back later, you know, Malthus comes a little bit later and actually suggests, well, here is a way of thinking at it, okay? And that way of thinking has a degree of truth, okay? So you think, well, there is growth, there is stuff, but it's not going to last forever. It's not going to go very far, right? There is something there in nature which looks like stationary state, right? And so you start thinking of the working of the economic system as if it is moving around some state, some condition, some way of doing things that is stationary, that is, that repeats itself quite equally in the long run. And again, if you are there at that time, it's hard to disagree with you. Right? Because yes, you understand there has been progress, you understand that you live a lot better than, say, the Romans or the Egyptian. You start to understand that you're also starting to live quite a lot better even of the luckiest among the Chinese, of which you have heard, or the Indians. But so there is a lot of progress, you understand that, but you don't see anything extraordinary that should really explode, and the idea that eventually this also will lead to a long run is quite convincing. Okay, so classical economic theory is built around that. Classical economic theory is built around a steady state because when one looked at things from that point of view, the world eventually went to a steady state. So how does the steady state work in their mind? The steady state in the mind of the classicals is there because really there is no technological progress. The classicals tend to think mostly in terms of expansion of what we call the extensive, the classical factor. Land, stock of capital. In the classical there is a distinction between variable and fixed capital. They distinguish having in mind agriculture or having in mind the initial form of industrial production. They distinguish between having the machinery or the cows or the horses or the plows or the spinning jenny in the factory, and the material, the variable capital that you have to put in, to feed the employees or to provide them. So they distinguish about its capital, and that's what they have in mind. There is land, okay, and there is labor. And labor, at the time, and again somewhat correctly, is mostly homogeneous labor. All right? That's just how many hours of work most people can do in 1700, most of the relevant productive jobs. Yes, there are artisans, some people are specialists, for sure, the notary, the medical doctor, and so on, they started to have a degree of independence, some engineer, the blacksmith, have some special skills, but you certainly do not have for productive. I think most of the people that get educated, they get educated actually not to produce. You don't educate scientists at the time or engineer, you educate philosopher, bureaucrats, lawyers, administrator, people like them, people like Smith, they go serve the powerful. We just starting to have, in fact, somewhere in England, and only in England, polytechnics. There are a few examples here and there of professional schools, but it's little stuff, right? So from their point of view, labor is mostly homogeneous. And so it's, even if they don't really write down a production function, it's quite interesting to realize that the word and the kind of economic theory to which the notion of a production function is better adapted, of a production function in the sense of a given technology that uses capital, labor, and land, right, to produce some kind of homogeneous output, is actually the work of the classical economist. Now there is an exception to it, and let's try to put that in perspective too, and the exception to it through the 19th century is actually Karl Marx. Karl Marx is the only one among the classical that in some sense realized, he uses a strange language, the development of productive forces, he calls it. But if you think of what the guy is thinking, he's realizing that there is technological progress, to a certain extent. He sees that there is this form of technological change that have taken place, that in fact what he seems to recognize is that the thing he calls capitalism is, it's a bit of misnomer, you understand capitalism. We should have a parenthesis about that. I mean, misnomer in the sense of having something special called capitalism that appears magically in the 17th or 18th century. It's a different thing that appears, which is some degrees of freedom from feudal constriction and free movement of labors and professional choice. But capitalism in the sense of private ownership, justified in a form or another, and protected in a way or another, of means of production, wealth, whatever you want, is as old as the Neolithic transition. The first capitalist was some farmer during the Neolithic transition that said, this is my house, this is my cow, these are my women, or one or two probably at the time that they had, and the children, and this is my property. I'm a capitalist, I own stuff, end of story. Okay, so capitalism in that sense, private ownership of means of production, is a very old object. Its legal forms have changed and keep changing, and what really is the transition in Europe between the 13th, or even earlier, 12th century, when it starts in certain areas. Here in Northern Europe, it starts, in Northern Italy it starts even earlier, right? We have commune, free citizens way earlier than year 1000, but anyhow, as it expands, is actually the freedom of labor, of individuals being free from from seigniorage, from servitudes, and having the freedom to move around and choose what to do. But anyhow, close parenthesis. What Marx clearly sees better than others is that there is a form of technological change that is taking progress, that is making labor more productive. He gives his own interpretation. His idea is that the more machines you put into a worker, the more productive that worker becomes. And to the extent that he's more productive, but you keep paying him roughly the same salary, right? Then you're exploiting it more, because the difference between what the worker produces and what you pay is your surplus value, is your exploitation. That's the idea, all right? And therefore exploitation increases. On the other hand, what is that also Marx says? He says, well, as you keep accumulating capital, you keep hiring workers. You cannot keep accumulating capital and hold the workers fixed. Now try to put that in some logical form. What does it mean? It means that the capital-labor ratio for every given technology is somehow bounded. I cannot keep increasing the capital-labor ratio. Eventually, once I get to a certain capital-labor ratio, there is no gain in adding more capital. If I want to expand production, I have to add more workers than workers and capital, right? And as I keep hiring more workers and I keep accumulating, eventually I exhaust the labor supply. I get to a situation in which labor supply is small compared to demand, and therefore wages go up above subsistence, and that will reduce the profit margin, the exploitation, right? Thereby, and here, you know, between in the third volume of Capital, he is probably the first one to address it. He says, well, here there is a reason to change technology, to do things better, to find a different way of exploiting from his point of view. That is, to make labor more productive by using a different combination between labor and capital, or using, if one looks at it objectively, a different kind of capital. Okay? That's pretty much Marx. All right? So clearly he has decreasing return for given technology in mind, if you think, right? Land, Marx pays less attention than others. He has already seen the land is becoming a secondary factor of production. So it's as central in being Smith and Ricardo that, thanks to the land, gives us a pretty general analytical tool, you know, factors with different productivity at the margin. If you think Ricardo is really the one, analytically, the big guy, right? He's got two things, and they're pretty much 50% of 49% of what we agree on. One is the idea of decreasing productivity of individual factors for when you hold all the other fixed, and therefore the creation of inframarginal rents, and the marginal producer, the marginal factor. And the other is the big gains from trade and the idea of comparative advantage, which is pretty much a strike of genius. Well, it's so obvious now. It's not so obvious, but have you ever tried to explain to your boyfriend that doesn't do economics, or your grandpa? People don't get it right away. You've got to try a lot of examples before they agree that actually does work.
Or they get it for trade but not for immigration.
They don't get it in general. They don't even get it between themselves and the barber shop next door. So those two tools are actually Ricardo's tools, which is Smith has a lot of observation and has some philosophical intuition, which are somewhat interesting, but not much. But really is not very analytical. I think Ricardo is a lot more an economist than Smith is. Anyhow, the point is that, now let's think again at Marx, right? These guys have decreasing return in mind, okay? And he has some form of technological problem. Where does he fail in some sense? What's the desire? Why is it the Marxism became this strange tool for idiocy instead of being the beautiful analytical tool it could have been? If you think, you can say, well, you know, Carlito just wanted to have fun and just wanted to have the revolution. That's one option. The other is he failed on one empirical observation. he thought that technological progress required an ever-growing too fast stock of capital and was eventually bounded. That is, the decrease in return eventually would hit you in the nose and make it impossible to keep a distance between average productivity and average wage, and therefore the margin to reward the capital investment, the technological innovation, the entrepreneurial risk would be squeezed and reduced to nothing, and that would be, the law of the fall of the profit rate that would lead obviously to the end of the capitalist system, because what's the point of investing if I cannot get any reward from it? The system will come to a halt. And remember, what he had in mind was growth. That's very interesting. If one reads Marx carefully, the point at which socialism becomes inevitable and capitalism, in his language,